I hate the news. I haven't watched the news in ages. We don't have cable, so there's sort of no way for me to watch the news on TV. But I can always see news on the internet, whatever. But whenever I visit someone's house and the news is on, it just makes me so frustrated. It makes me angry because whenever I see the stories that are being told, I can always just like see through them. I can always see that there's something inaccurate. There's always like a bias. They're trying to scare you. They want to sell you something. They want to keep you watching. But like they're not being honest, and it's just really blatantly obvious all the time, anytime I see the news. And so, like, that's a big thing for me. I really hate it. It really frustrates me. Most young people probably don't even watch the news anymore. They don't even probably have cable, and they probably watch stuff on the internet, which, might be news, but it's just presented in a different way. So, despite the fact that most people don't watch the news, like the 6 o'clock news on the TV, they still do watch the news. They still do consume the news. And a lot of the stories that they watch, they do come from the news. You have like a story on CNN or whatever, and then some people do commentary on it, and they present like different perspectives on it, and then you can like find those opinions or those perspectives on the internet somewhere, right? And then you watch that. So like it's the news. It's just being presented through someone else's filter. And like that's a lot about like what talk radio is, about podcasts, like so much stuff that we consume on the internet is the news. It's just sort of repackaged or sort of formatted through someone else's opinion and perspective, and then presented to a new set of users who aren't necessarily watching the original source. One problem though that I find with the news is that often very sort of shallow articles or stories, and like obviously there's depth sometimes, but like most stories are kind of shallow. And a big part of this is like the economics of creating content, right? Like you have to create a certain amount of content, and so you only have a certain amount of time. And so you have to sort of choose what to write about for any topic that needs to be covered. But that choice automatically creates a bias. It creates an opinion that might not necessarily present all of the facts. This creates something different from like the actual event, right? Like when you have perspective or you have opinion or you have bias influencing what you're consuming, then it's not news anymore, right? Like it's opinion. Like so much of what we consume on the internet, so much of what we see on TV it's claimed to be news, but it's actually someone's opinion. It's actually someone's commentary, or it's their bias, and they're commenting or giving perspective on something that's happened. And so much of what we consume is actually opinion, even if it claims to be the news. And so many people say that we should be informed. We shouldn't be uninformed by not watching the news. But the whole thing is that anytime we consume news, we are being misinformed. And this is like an emergent property, like it's an emergent thing. Like people aren't intentionally misinforming us, but they are misinforming us by the very nature of sort of expressing their opinion, by telling a story, by the way that a story is framed. All of these things are changing sort of the factual nature of the story, and they're creating an opinion that's different from the reality of the event. The problem with that is that means that you're being misinformed about what's happened, because all of these factors are influencing what's being presented. And when you consume it, then you're not necessarily getting the facts. You're getting so much like opinion and bias, and even just marketing. And I would say like generally, like the media or the news, because of its sort of need for eyes and clicks, there's like this emphasis on the bad news, on the negative, and people feed off of that. It's so sad, it's so negative, and I just really don't like it because I don't want to feel, bad. Like I can just look outside and I can see how great the world is, but like the more you consume of the news or the media, the more you feel like things are worse than they really are. And I kind of get this when I talk to like some of my friends and some of my family. It's just like they have this perception that things are so bad and so terrible. Like they're not. Like things are so much better than they seem. And then part of this is because people watch the news. They consume too much news. They have this misrepresentation of reality that doesn't count for 99% of experience. At the same time, it's like we don't necessarily think that, because we're always told about the bad things. We're always told about the negative, and that's going to influence our feelings. It's going to make us feel worse. It's going to make us feel stressed. It's going to make us feel anxious about the world around us, even if we shouldn't feel that way, or even if it's not necessarily to feel that way. And you know what? Like the news is kind of traumatic. Like just think of like everyone who watched sort of 9/11 when it happened. People were like almost traumatized by that experience because it was so terrible to see it happen, and like it was just constantly on TV. I remember it just like over and over again on the TV at the time, like for weeks, and that was all that we saw. And I can imagine like people were like traumatized by that. It was like a traumatic experience that probably like stuck with people for a very long time. And like it's a bad event, it's a terrible event, it's terrible things. But like to to know what happened is important, but like to be exposed to the trauma of like the constant, like repetitive nature of it being presented in the way that it was when it happened on the news, like that was definitely have a negative effect on people. Oftentimes you'll hear like the 1 in 1,000, the 1 in 100 chance. And obviously those are the things that are interesting, but at the same time, those are the things that are like also not so important because like they're edge cases, right? Like, sure, it's like this, it's great to hear that this person became a billionaire because they started this business, right? But like that's not most people. And what makes that interesting is like the fact that it was that one person happened, but like it's not really that important, right? Like it's unimportant because it's so niche and it doesn't affect anyone except that person. And so many of us are like convinced that propaganda doesn't exist. We think, oh, that only happens in other countries. But like all the time, information is framed. It exists to shape our opinions, to influence the way that we think about topics, ideas. There's also agendas. There's like political agendas. There's even corporate agendas that are filled into this news. And the reason that we're told certain stories is because they benefit some people's power or they benefit some companies' sort of bottom lines. The more we believe certain things that get us to buy products or consume things, that's better for somebody, right? So like that's a reason why we'll hear those stories. And then just overlying all of this, there's like bias. There's always bias. There's always someone's like understanding or their like what they think is what matters, and they get to choose what we get to hear about. And so, but like there's always these things, right? There's always agendas. There's always bias, and there's always propaganda. And I just feel like the news is more like junk food than like vegetables, you know. And you can eat some junk food, but you probably shouldn't eat junk food all the time because it's not good for you. You know, then the question becomes like, if the news is so bad, then why does it even exist? And I think like a big thing is that people are curious about the world around us, like around them. Like people want to understand what's going on. They want to understand what's happened. They're curious about things that they, didn't experience in their own life. They want to know what's happened. So there's this underlying curiosity about the world around us. And so that's probably why people are drawn to news or things like news. But the other side of that is like the reason why the news continues to be processed or created is because it serves advertisers, right? Like it's a financial interest to corporations for there to be a place for people to watch news, because that's like sort of eyes watching advertisements, but it's also those are potential customers who can be influenced to purchase products or behave in certain ways that are good for corporations or political powers. And so again, like, yes, the news exists to serve the powerful or to give more power, and it also serves the corporations in that they get more money. And that's kind of, I feel like that's why the news exists. Like, yes, people are curious and people are looking for things to watch, but like the news is like a really good way to capture those audiences. The way that the news tells a story is for the benefit of the advertisers. Like, you're unlikely to hear negative stories about the sponsors of a television show. And so the news by necessity has to be soft with those companies. They have to be soft with those industries. And at the same time, it's like those are the exact industries that they should be questioning. And so like there's this unfortunate situation where like an agenda has to be pushed, but questioning that agenda should be the role of the media. And then but there's like this delicate balance of like advertisers and sponsors, and then like the truth. The truth sort of suffers at the fact that it's not necessarily economical to tell the truth. But one thing I would say is that like these days, like we're pretty lucky that we have the internet, right? Because we don't have to rely on a newspaper. We don't have to rely on the 6 o'clock news. We can go on the internet. We can look up issues that we're concerned about, and we can get different perspectives if we want to. But we can just kind of find information for ourselves, and so we can get like a more fuller perspective on things. We can get a more fuller understanding of things if we're interested in it and if we want to. Most young people probably just use the internet anyways, and they don't necessarily rely on traditional media, and that's a good thing, I would say, for the most part. It's a good thing because it gives people choice, it gives people options, it gives them a chance to make up their own mind instead of being told like sort of the corporate political agenda that they're supposed to believe. And obviously those things exist in alternative sources, but they're not as blatant sometimes. They're a little bit softer because there's so many different perspectives that can be taken, and there's so many different audiences that certain people apply to. In the past, people had to rely on the news. They had to rely on newspapers because that was all that there was. But now that we have more choices, then we should take advantage of them. So my question to you is, do you watch the news? Do you like the news? Do you find the news informative or interesting? Let me know in the comments below. If you are curious about knowing how to think, but you don't know but you don't want to be told what to think, then click that subscribe button because I'd really appreciate it. And if you found this entertaining or informative, click that like button. You've been watching Making Sense with Robbie. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk next time. Goodbye.